All right. So, who here has already worked with WebWorks on the BlackBerry platform? Oh, I was going to make a joke about the fact that I can't actually tell because of the spotlights that everybody had their hands up, but everybody had their hands up. This is good. So we are going to talk here in JAM336 about the web APIs, specifically PIM and Invocation. My name is Ken Wallis. I'm the product manager for WebWorks, and I'll be talking to you about these today. These are two separate but complementary APIs on the WebWorks platform that we're going to take a look at. It's a quick overview of what we're going to cover. We've got a lot to cover. There's a lot more detail than we're going to see here, but it should get you started with what the PIM and Invoke frameworks can offer to you in your WebWorks applications. We're going to start with PIM, and right now with WebWorks, we have access from APIs to the calendar and to the contacts databases of information, and we'll see what we can do there. Just a quick background and sort of where we are with BlackBerry 10. We're really building on the history and the DNA of what BlackBerry has always provided to developers, and in some ways enhanced from other platforms in terms of exposing these concepts to you as developers and providing these mechanisms to allow you to integrate into device systems and databases of information. With BlackBerry 10, we've really wanted to take PIM and really supersize it for everything that we're offering in the BlackBerry 10 environment, and taking this concept of integrated data and applications to the next level. And there's really an enhanced flow of information between the calendar and the address book, and we expose a lot of this data to you in WebWorks as well. As we've gone on with BlackBerry 10, as many of you are familiar, most likely that WebWorks has been around since 5.0 of the BlackBerry OS operating system. With BlackBerry 10, we re-implemented yet again on top of the native platform for BlackBerry 10. And we took a little bit of a new eye at APIs and signatures, and decided that where it made sense, we'd obviously use HTML5 standard specifications for API signatures. Obviously, if they're offered in the browser itself, we just let the browser deal with it. But whenever it came to the point where we needed to provide functionality that was WebWorks specific, we actually looked at Cordova first. Apache Cordova is the open source project that came out of the PhoneGap framework. When Adobe purchased the company behind PhoneGap, the source code was contributed to Apache to be truly third-party open source ran. So that's really kind of the center of gravity we're finding with mobile web applications for cross-platform. And we wanted to make sure that we're aligning as much as possible with what they're doing as well. So sometimes some of the APIs actually change signatures. They offer the same functionality, but are different signatures in BlackBerry 10 than they were in our previous platforms. So something to be aware of. But it's really about connecting your address book and your calendar together. And if you've had a chance to play with BlackBerry 10 already, you'll notice that the address book is really much more powerful than we've had in the past, and the same with the calendar. And the hub is also integrating a lot of that information. If you've seen some of our demos, where you're in the hub, you can drag down from the top and you can see some of the events that are coming up in your day as well. So bringing all the information related to what you're trying to do, the people you're connecting with in these things that you're doing, bringing them right to the forefront and providing the underlying layer of database information that allows these experiences to be provided to you. This is all available to WebWorks developers as well. One quick thing to note, hopefully by now you're somewhat familiar with our Config.xml file. In order to access the data related to PIM information, you need to provide these permissions in your Config.xml. And what happens when your application first runs is the user is prompted to say that your application is requesting access to contact and calendar information. And the user will be provided the ability to accept or deny. So you need to handle this correctly. If the user denies your application permission to access this information, you'll need to handle that gracefully and make sure that your application is, doesn't completely bog down or not work. Something to be aware of. So let's take a look at contacts. Really, this is somewhat straightforward in terms of what address book information is provided on many different platforms. So there's all the basic information that you're used to: phone numbers, addresses, email addresses, all that great information. With BlackBerry 10, we've taken it a bit further and provided enhanced related data related to your contact, including news feeds, which is related to the companies and communities that the address book entry has. So it can bring in information related to, BlackBerry for myself, or whatever company that you're related to. I need to update that screenshot from Research in Motion to BlackBerry, I just realized. It also brings in an activity log, which is very interesting. It will bring in the history of different interactions you've had with this person. If you've had phone calls, if you've had previous meetings in history, different emails as well. They'll show up in that activity pane on the right in the standard address book, as well as social connections. So it provides you information about what contacts, social accounts have been activated, like Twitter or Facebook and such. All this information is provided to you as well from the PIM database in WebWorks, and we'll take a look at some of these. So we'll take a little bit of time to look at some code. I wanted to get a little bit in depth with some of the APIs and signatures and how you actually create applications with some code. This is about creating a new contact, so probably one of the most straightforward use cases you might have. Everything is done through the Contacts API namespace. And you'll notice here I've actually shortened this a little bit for the sake of cleanliness. The Contacts namespace is actually under blackberry.pim.contacts, but I just wanted to remove it for the sake here. So this code example wouldn't actually work on its own, but something to be aware of. I just wanted to clean it up a bit. This is showing creating a new contact with a home phone number and a work email, a family name and a given name, and then it's pretty straightforward, contacts.create. You pass in your object structure there with the display name, the name and the home number and phone numbers, the phone numbers and the work emails that you've set. And then this very last line at the bottom, contact.save, is very important. Nothing actually gets pushed to the database until you do contact.save. This applies even if you're just modifying an existing contact. All of this that you're doing within the JavaScript API here is sort of sandboxed in the WebWorks framework until you say contact.save, and then it gets pushed to the database. So something you definitely need to be aware of. Of course, we have all of the sort of typical operations you might expect for operating on the database. You can find existing entries. I wanted to call out this code here, the very first parameter there, name in brackets. This is actually an array of fields in the address in the contact card that will be returned. So by default, not all of the fields on a contact will be returned to you, only the ones that you specify in that first parameter. I'm pretty sure there's like a constant that you can say return all. But the reason for this is basically a performance and optimization reason, especially because we've brought in a lot of social connection entries into the address book. I think you'll find on BlackBerry 10 your address book will be much bigger than you may have seen on previous BlackBerry OSs. And so if you're returning a whole bunch of those with all of the information related to them, you'll get a lot of data. And for performance reasons, it will just return the specific fields you may be interested in. You probably aren't going to care about all of the fields at any given time. So it's going to be use case based, but something to keep in mind. Obviously, once you've found a contact or provided the user the ability to select which one they're interested in, you might want to modify information on that entry. You can set any field that you want, and make sure you call contact.save again. Delete is pretty straightforward. It's contact.remove. That's an existing contact that you've retrieved or one that you found. You don't have to do contact.save after that. Remove just takes it out. So I wanted to get a little bit into some of these enhanced PIM capabilities that we've provided on BlackBerry 10. This really ties your calendar events, call logs, and emails into your address book with the activity information. It provides a lot of information to you, the description of the activity, the MIME type, so this will tell you if it's a phone call or an email or an address book entry, a calendar entry, the timestamp of when this activity occurred, and the direction. Direction is related to phone calls. So it tells you whether it was an outgoing call that you made to this contact or if that contact called you. It's not pertinent to the other types of activity, just to phone calls. So on a contact, you can get direct access to an array of all of the activities for that person through the contact.activities property. And you can select on the MIME type, what kind of type it is, and then maybe set some HTML tags with descriptions or however you want to structure this data. This screenshot is just of the standard address book on the BlackBerry 10 OS, so it gives you an idea of what these things might look like. But you can present it any way that you want with your own HTML. Contact news, this gives you a whole bunch of information about news articles related to the organization for your contact. Gives you the source, the body of the information, companies that might have also been called out in this news article, when it was published, the title, the type, and the URI. So this is all handled in our background services and provided to you on the device, and you have access to this and, again, present it however you want. But this is going to show some of this kind of additional contextual information that we're trying to bring into BlackBerry 10 and the contacts and making it much more, a much bigger set of rich information related to your contacts and how you interact with people. So we're going to switch over quickly to the device and show you a quick example of a WebWorks application that leverages the contacts API. First, I'll actually jump into the address book and just show you. Right now, I just have an entry for myself. Not much detail on it. I just put a dummy entry in there. But I'll jump to the PIM Contacts WebWorks app. This actually leverages the BBUI framework to do a bit of UI building for you. But if I search based on last name, it'll return my entry that was in the address book. I can also add a new entry. Everybody's favorite DevRel person. We'll give his nickname of Bacon Man, because he really likes bacon. I'll jump back out to the address book and show you that there's now an entry, hopefully, for Adam. And if I go into edit, it'll show under the nickname Bacon Man. So if I actually show you again the other way, bacon is good. Save that. Probably have to restart my PIM contacts. Search for Stanley. Bacon is good. So this is just a quick demonstration of using the PIM APIs and how it interacts directly with the address book. So those are just some quick, find, create, modify actions that I just showed you in a WebWorks application. So let's jump into calendar. This is obviously, again, straightforward, operating in the calendar events. A quick question? Yeah?
A question regarding calendar.
Yeah.
If we delete contacts, does the user get confirmation or something?
The question is, if you delete a contact, if the user gets confirmation. We leave that up to you to decide if you're going to delete a contact, if you'll tell the user within your application whether that happens or not. Nothing by the platform will do that for you.
So WebWorks app could basically wipe the entire contacts database?
Exactly. So that goes. So the follow-up was that the WebWorks app could remove everything from your address book. Yes, that's possible. And that's also why the system implements that permissions thing. I'm not sure if you were here at the beginning. Yes. So in your Config.xml, you put in your permissions, and the user is told that the application is looking for access to the address book, and they can accept or deny that. But then at that point, it's up to the developer of that application what they're doing with that data. So yeah. So a calendar. You have full access to everything that's within the calendar framework, including multiple calendars. So if you've set up multiple email addresses on your BlackBerry 10 device, there'll usually be multiple calendars related to those email addresses. I think there's even calendars for social connections. As well, it also integrates with these social networks as well, and we'll get into that in a bit. I wanted to start off with finding, since we looked a lot at creating for contacts. So I'll jump into finding for calendars. It's really pretty straightforward. You set up a filter, and you can specify a number of different properties that you can set search criteria on. I've chosen prefix here. I believe prefix will look at the title as well as the body of the calendar entry. I also believe it will look at names of attendees, but I'm not positive about that. But you just set a string value, and it's just a prefix information. It'll just find that string directly. You set up your find options object, and then pass that into BlackBerry PIM calendar.find events, and set your find success and find error callbacks. So the system will go off, look for events, and will return to you what it found in this on find success callback. So if you're familiar with the BlackBerry 10 WebWorks API, you'll see a lot of this success fail callback structure because a lot of these calls are asynchronous, and they'll come back to you with the information or tell you, I didn't find anything. That would actually come through on find success, that there was no entries, but if there was an actual error in the search, it would come back on find error. Of course, we have create, update, delete actions as well. And if you're doing those, again, you'll want to do calendar.save to update that information. Folders is related to multiple calendars on the device, and they're just called folders in the API. And something to be aware of, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this at the end of this calendar section, is that it does respect, as well as the address book, it respects the consumer enterprise perimeter differentiation. So depending on where your application is installed, you'll get access to those related address books and calendar data. And I'll talk a little bit about that more later. So you can, from an event, you can get the calendar folders related to it. And I'm just showing a quick console log. You can get from the folder, you can get a calendar name and the email related to that, that calendar. You can set recurrences from our API as well in WebWorks. So quite often in the enterprise space especially, you'll set up events that are recurring daily, weekly, every second Thursday, the 29th of February every year. You can set this with day and week. There's a whole bunch of options in this repeat rule structure that you can set, so you can look at our API reference for that information. And it's pretty straightforward. You have an event, you just set the recurrence property with this repeat rule object, and your recurrences are ready to go. And of course, with recurrences, quite often you have exceptions to this recurrences. So on some February date, they need to move it to the next day. So you can set an exception for a given event. And you actually, when you create this exception, you set the original date for that exception as sort of the key for this recurrence, for this exception for recurrence. You set the new start date and the new end date, and just put exception event.save. And it will find from this key of the date that you put in at the beginning as that recurrence, and we'll set that one to be the new information. So BlackBerry Balance. So this is one of the key kind of differentiating features that we've defined in BlackBerry 10. It's quite powerful in terms of enabling the bring your own device sort of paradigm that we're seeing in enterprise. And it separates the device into two distinct profiles, personal and corporate. And if your application is deployed through the public BlackBerry World interface, it will go into the personal perimeter. If it's deployed from the enterprise BlackBerry World, it will go into the enterprise perimeter. And by default, depending on where your application is installed, you'll get access to that perimeter's data. So if your app is installed into the consumer perimeter, you'll have access to the consumer side calendar and contacts information. And if you're an enterprise, the enterprise data. And you cannot cross that boundary. in your application. It's handled for you. You don't explicitly need to know, depending on what you're trying to do in your application, but most likely your application will be targeted at one or the other, and it probably won't matter to you which one, so you won't necessarily have to worry about this, but you do need to know about it. I believe yesterday JAM335 occurred. We'll have all of our sessions put up online that you can look at later. If you're interested in this kind of differentiation and how to handle that and what opportunities there are in the enterprise space, I'd encourage you to check out JAM305. John Mutter is usually a pretty entertaining guy, so I'm sure it was an interesting session, so take a look at it. So that's PIM. So obviously there's more there than I was able to cover here, but we need to move on to invocation. In many ways, I think this is in many ways more interesting and also more powerful than PIM. It really enables the whole concept of integration. If you've been familiar with BlackBerry over the years, we had a concept of super apps for a while in terms of kind of a branding mechanism. It's really encapsulating the ability to interact with other systems, services, and applications on the device and how you interact between them and pass data or leverage functionality from different places. Invocation is the BlackBerry 10 mechanism to do that. This is a picture to try and describe the different services that are provided by Invocation. And I'll talk a little bit about each of these in more detail later, but quickly, the very straightforward concept is invoking another application. You're just calling out to somebody else with a specific target information to say, I want you to go and do this, and go and do it and return me data if you need to, or just perform a function. I don't care what happens. It depends on what the use case is. Brokering is sort of I don't even know what I'm invoking, but I know I want something to do something. So an example would be, I want to display an image, but I don't want to do it within my own application. I just want to send out to the system and say, here's a JPEG, display it in some picture viewer. You don't know that there's a specific application that you want to view the picture with. You just say, go display it. And the system will broker this and say, okay, what applications or systems on the device can do this for you, and which is the best one. It uses some logic based on what is the best one to use in this instance. And it will fire it up with this invocation and do it for you. So you don't have to necessarily know what app or system is out there to do an action. You can just fire it off and the system will handle it for you. If there's multiple, it can also provide a UI for the user to select. This will usually happen. There are some cases if it's just one target, it'll just go and do it and it won't tell the user which one it's targeting because there's only one target for it. You can also query the system and say what is out there to handle, for example, the image viewing. Is there some application or system out there that can display an image for me? And this is the querying aspect. If you don't want to use the built-in UI to tell the user which one, to ask the user which one to use, you can provide your own UI based on the query and the data you get back from it. Menu service is something behind the scenes that you won't ever really need to know about, but it is the system that takes this information of targets that are on the system and will provide entries into the context menu based on an action. So if the user long presses on an element in your application and brings the context menu in, the menu service will populate that with information on targets related to that context. So we're going to talk a little bit about that more later. But it's something that the system does for you. And also the system will handle transferring data between applications when you do an invocation. You don't have to worry about transporting a file to another application. The system does it for you. If you're passing larger bits of data, you'll want to use files rather than just passing it directly in Invoke. And again, I'll talk about that a bit later. Invoke is really what powers the whole concept of peak and flow, of layering of functionality on top of each other within your application. and allowing you to flow through pieces of functionality without going in and out of applications. Many of these concepts are powered by cards, which is a single screen of information or functionality that's brought into your application. The user interacts with it, does its action, and then it goes away. And it also is this concept of stacking of cards where you can peek back, see what else is behind it, or peek right back to the root of your application. It powers this flow concept. And it's all through the BlackBerry.Invoked namespace in WebWorks. This is an example of a raw BlackBerry invocation call. You set up a target saying that whether it's going to be a picture card or a picture app, you can specify if you know your specific target you want to use. Often this will be a system service that we've documented that the system provides to you. You know about it. You want to actually hit that specific target for your invocation. Here I say picture.card because I'm going to show you a demo of a picture viewer later. But it could be something like the BlackBerry browser. If you know you don't have to specify it, because if you just specify an HTTP call, it will do it for you. But a specific system target could be the BlackBerry browser. You specify the action that you want to do. There's about 3 or 4 predefined actions. Here's this concept of viewing. I just want to view something, but there's probably not going to be any real interaction from the user in this invocation. It could be open. It could be edit as well. So maybe you're passing a document to the Docs2Go application, and it's going to be edited. That would be a different action. You can specify the MIME type of what you're passing. And this could be inferred from the URI if you're just passing the URI of what you're invoking. But you can also explicitly specify the type. And then these last two, URI and data, they are exclusive. So you'd only really ever specify one or the other in a direct invocation. You're either passing the actual data in your invoke call, or you're passing a reference to data, like a file system file. In data, you can specify, I think, up to 4 kilobits of information, I think is the limit. So if you have anything more that you want to pass, you'll need to use files and store it. And then the invocation framework will handle passing that data between it through the files to the next to your invocation target. Then, of course, on success and on error callbacks, depending on whether that invocation succeeded or not. This can be a little bit overwhelming when you first look at it. This is the raw invoke functionality, but we've also provided APIs for specific targets from the system that you can use that abstract a lot of this information of needing to know what target, what action, that kind of thing, and we'll look at some of these examples. But in other cases, you'll need to specify an actual raw invocation for different things, so I wanted to make sure you understood this one. This is an example of querying targets. So I know that I want to display a JPEG, but I want to control the user experience. I want to provide the user with my own experience of choosing what target to view this JPEG image in. So I'm going to request from the system who out there can open a JPEG image. You specify the action that you're doing, open, the type, the URI, target type, whether you care about whether if it's a full application, which means that you would actually see your application go into the active tiles field and the new application pop up and handle this, or whether you want to do a viewer, which is bringing in a single frame card into the application without the user having to leave. So it depends on what you're doing. You might want to go straight to a full application, or you might just want to use the card. But you can specify which targets you actually care about here. And all the different actions you can specify what you want to do. And then BlackBerry Invoke.query, pass in your request. And on success, when that's called, we'll give you all of the targets that came back as being able to open a JPEG image for you. Then you can take that information and do your own UI if you want to specify, or you can just select one and fire it off, and the user will get a JPEG viewer. So I'm going to show you a WebWorks demo application that uses Invocation. And then after, I'll show you a bit of code that will show you how some of these different invokes worked. It's a pretty straightforward application. again, built with BBUI to do a very quick UI layout. Invoking the browser, this actually invokes an application. So as you saw, the WebWorks app went into the background, and the browser came in. Wi-Fi here is terrible, unfortunately, so that didn't actually bring up anything. But invoking the picture viewer, this is, again, this example of bringing a card in. So as you see, this is just a card that's layered into the application to view an image and enables that sort of flow experience. This is the system picture viewer. So, but I'm calling that out specifically because I'm going to show you something right now, which is this invoke bound card. What this is going to do is invoke another WebWorks application as a card. So we implemented a WebWorks picture viewer as a card, and this came into another WebWorks application as a card. So I'm going to jump back out and show you this other WebWorks app, which is called the card. So I had this question yesterday when we talked about invocation, whether WebWorks can actually provide cards, and they can. So as a WebWorks app, you can be invoked, and you can invoke others. And you can provide card functionality as well. When I invoked it here, it's blank because I wasn't invoked with any data. I don't know what image I'm viewing here because I invoked the application directly. But if I close that and go back here, I'll close that guy too. When I call this invoke bound card at the top, I actually pass in a URI to a file into that WebWorks app, and now I'm displaying the image. And I even have an example of a share here, so I'm just invoking the share target selector. And here all I have is enabled is NFC sharing. But if I had Facebook or Twitter accounts set up on here, they would show up in this list as well. A couple of other neat ones is camera and file picker. So if I can invoke the camera card composer comes in here, and I can take a picture of you guys, but I won't do that to you. But this is a card as well that came into your application without leaving it. And a file picker as well. So quite often you might want to choose a file to operate on in your application. And this is all, again, brought right into your application, and you never left it. So I can just dismiss that, hopefully. Nope, that one you can't. But that's a quick demo. This is a WebWorks app bringing in a lot of functionality into your app. You've never left it. Question there?
Do you have cards for calendar and contact person?
The question is whether you have cards for calendar and contacts. Yes, you do. One of my sort of pet peeves right now is that we don't have sufficient documentation about all the different system invocation targets there are. If you go to the native documentation, there is a whole bunch of documentation on different targets of invocation, including calendar and address book. You can create a new event with a card. You can create a new contact from a card. We're in the process right now of reviewing the documentation for WebWorks to just change the code examples from native to WebWorks calls, and then we'll get those posted on our developer zone very quickly.
So the edit screen you showed with creating a person is also available as a card?
Yes, the edit screen for editing or composing a new contact is also available from the system as a card, so you don't have to implement that yourself if you don't want to. You can just invoke the system address book cards for that functionality. Yeah. Any question here?
Can we invoke the native maps application?
Can you invoke the native maps application? Yes, you can. I've heard there might be a few issues with that if you've tried it, but you can give it a try. But we're definitely working on that one, but you can invoke the maps application. And you can even pass in places of interest data as well. So we'll put little pins on the map of those locations. So I think question back there?
That was mine, and
Okay.
up it just a little bit more than get your location and walk me to that point of interest.
Question is whether you can actually provide like directions to a point of interest from your. I suspect, but I'm not positive. I'll have to look that up. I'm not sure about that one. Oh, yep.
Is this on the WebWorks examples on GitHub?
Yes, this demo application is in the GitHub. Demo applications in GitHub / BlackBerry 10 WebWorks samples. Yeah, this exact one is in there. This one might be in the community samples repo. We actually have two separate ones. There's sort of the BlackBerry 10 WebWorks samples is our official supported sample repository, and then there's a community one that has a lot of community contributions into it as well. I think this one is in the main WebWorks samples, but it'll be in one of the two. So let's look at a little bit of code of how this stuff worked. This is probably one of the most straightforward and simple raw invocations you could ever make. You want to open a web page. All you have to do is specify the URI that you want to go to BlackBerry.com. And the system knows I need to fire up the browser to handle HTTP protocols. You don't even have to specify the MIME type. All you do is specify the URI, and the Invoke framework determines what you're trying to do based on this information. There could potentially be other applications that handle HTTP as well. You might have a second or third-party browser on the application at some point. So at that point, it would have to prompt the user which one they want to target. But as it stands right now, it would just go off, fire up our browser with the BlackBerry.com website.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Can you do this from QML? No.
Question is whether you can do this from QML. Not sure. I'm not a No, not sure. I'm quite certain you probably can, but I don't want to confirm that.
Looks like you ought to be able to.
Yeah. I wanted to give you a quick example here of something I talked about much earlier in terms of HTML5 standards. Obviously, we support a wider range of the HTML5 spec. One of them is the input type, and is including the file picker. So if all you really care about is just picking a file, you don't have to go down to a WebWorks API to do that. You can use an input type of file. And underneath the covers, it will invoke our native file picker, bring it in as a card, allow the user to select it and return it. Stepping a bit further here, obviously this also works within the browser from a standard web page. So a standard web page, if it has a file picker on it or an input file type, it will invoke our card file picker as well in the browser. So it's something that it's pretty interesting. Same, actually I'm going to get to it later in another slide, so we'll go back to that. But our file picker has many options on it. You can specify whether it needs to be in a picker mode or a save mode. So if you want to save a file and provide the user the ability to choose the location to save the file, that's a separate mode for the same file picker card. You can also specify the file picker to be limited to types of image or video. You specify that in this type field here. Because of all these options, we wanted to provide an API to you to abstract how you construct a raw invocation to do all these different permutations of information. So we created a sub namespace, blackberry.invoke.card. And in this instance, we're looking at the Invoke File Picker API. This one's well documented in our API reference and shows you how to use it to invoke File Picker in many different ways. There are a few other options under blackberry.invoke.card, including the email composer card. I think we actually specified a API for that as well as the camera, because there are many different options for the camera, which I'm going to talk about now. This is the two different ways you can use and invoke the camera card. Again, from an input type, and this is relatively new in the HTML5 spec, you can specify an attribute capture. And right now there are, in the spec, 3 different values you can specify for capture. There's camera, camcorder, and I believe it's microphone is the third one. The spec supports input and capturing of audio. Our browser implementation does not currently support that because on this revision of BlackBerry 10, there's not a dedicated audio recording card. That's just a native platform, I would say, missing piece right now. So we only support camera and camcorder from the input type. But this would actually show you from the browser. This doesn't have to be a WebWorks application. So in the browser, you could have input, type file, capture camera, and it will bring in our camera card into the browser window, capture an image, and return it to the input field. But we also have the BlackBerry Invoke Card Invoke Camera API. There are many different modes here, well, 3 different modes. There's photo, video, which map to camera or camcorder. But this third one, camera mode full, this is one that you might find interesting and might want to use because that would allow the user access to the time shift functionality that you've seen in the demos. If you specify just directly photo or video, it goes specifically to that type of capture in the camera card. But if you specify full, you'll get what users typically would experience when they go to our camera application. If you've used that yet, you'll notice in the top right of the camera viewfinder window, there's a little UI widget that allows the user to specify whether they want to capture video, a still image, or time shift. If you specify camera mode full, that UI will appear in the card that comes into your application as well, and the user can do time shift if they want here within your application. That was one of the main reasons why we actually created this API specifically. Again, because of the many options, it could get confusing to try and create a raw invocation call passing all this information properly. So we created this API for you. So I wanted to get into quickly how you would process return data from a card after you've invoked it. Obviously, from a camera application or a camera invocation, you want to get the data back, what the user actually captured. So you add an event listener on the onChild card closed event and pass in a function callback of what will happen when the card is closed. And the invoked card will return a request structure with the reason. So here it would be, in this example, it's saved that the user actually selected a file or captured a photo. It could be cancel, which means the user didn't actually perform this operation. They decided to decline picking a file or capturing an image. So you get this back saying cancel, I think, is the actual value. So you would know that nothing was done. Returns you the type. So this is the MIME type of what data was captured or taken, and the path to the actual saved file.
Sorry, is that a path or data? Uses the URI which has been...
Good question. I think that this could be actual data. I'll have to go back and look at the API reference, so we can take a look at that after. But I think it could be the actual data or the URI to the path. So being invoked. So this is what I was mentioning when I showed you the picture viewer that was implemented in a WebWorks application. This is how a WebWorks app can be invoked by others. Very powerful paradigm in this kind of two-way flow of data. It's all captured in the Config.xml file, and you specify a rim invoke target element. And this will, when the application is installed on the system will look at this Config.xml, see that there's this invoke target, and register your application with the Invoke framework, saying that you can do these types of actions, process this kind of information. And so if somebody is trying to invoke a card previewer type with a view action on a JPEG file, your application would show up as a target for this action for others. And so if you would show up in an invoke selection UI from the system, that kind of thing. So you can get very specific with this filter information. You can even specify file extensions if you want, if you only care about specific file extensions. I believe you can also even specify domains. So you can specify you only care about local content coming from the system or content coming from specific domains like BlackBerry.com, something like that. So you can get very specific. I didn't want to clutter this up with that information, but it's a very powerful paradigm. So a quick example of the picture viewer that I showed you. The code here is just when I invoked the card application straight from the UI, it was blank because it's just an empty image tag in the HTML for this WebWorks app. And what would happen is when you're actually invoked as a card, you listen for this BlackBerry.event add event listener. So you listen for the invoked event. And this onInvoked info comes in to your callback function. You get the element by ID of image, so you're getting this HTML image tag, and you're setting the source to the file reference that was passed into you by the other application. So when I actually invoke the picture viewer, I send in the URI path of the image, and that will come in this onInvoked info structure under URI. I just set the image tag source to that, and it just displays the picture for you. So that's how that example worked that I showed you earlier. So for more information, this is just scratching the surface. As I said, Invoke framework is very powerful, so you want to take a look at our BlackBerry.invoke namespace. And until next week, you'll also want to look at the native documentation under Invocation for a lot of the different system targets that you can do. Now that you've seen our invocation structure and how it's created, you can look at the native code samples and recreate it in WebWorks. But as I said, hopefully next week we'll have specific WebWorks documentation for this as well, with actual WebWorks code examples as well. But it has about, I think, 15 different targets, including the email and contacts that we talked about, maps, camera, that kind of thing. So there's a whole bunch of targets you can use. For the PIM APIs, you can look at blackberry.pim.contacts and blackberry.pim.calendar. And of course, there's lots of samples. I think with BlackBerry 10, we've gone further than we've ever been with sample code to get you guys started. So take a look at those examples in GitHub for a lot of information there. The obligatory last slide that you'll see, I'm sure you've seen 5 or 6 times already. Download the mobile conference guide because you've got still an afternoon of great sessions to go take a look at. Make sure to complete your session surveys as well as the conference survey as well. And thanks for attending BlackBerry Jam Europe. So I think we have 5-10 minutes for questions. So go there first.
When invoking the browser, it's possible to submit form data automatically from form.
The question is, if you invoke the browser, if you can specify form data to fill that out. I don't believe so, but that's an interesting use case for sure. I'll have to talk to the browser guys if that can be done in an invocation or not. I'm not positive. There's a mic coming around, so if you don't mind, there's a question here in the front. Yeah.
Is it possible to access the social media accounts? For example, to get access to the Facebook credentials to display the timeline or something like that?
The question, well, sorry, you didn't hear the question. Now you've got a mic. You can invoke the social media through sharing. So you can specify data to share in a tweet or update the Facebook timeline. You don't have direct access to Facebook single sign-on type of information, but we do have samples in our GitHub repository that show you how you can set up authentication with Facebook or Twitter in your own application as well. So we have examples on how to do OAuth within a WebWorks application as well. But you don't have direct access to the already pre-configured accounts through the account system settings. There's a question back there.
A couple of questions. When you receive an Invoke card event, does it always go into index.html, or can you actually specify it to go into a different route straight away, or do you have to receive it on index and then route it to the correct subpart of your app?
It depends on where you set that event listener, really. So wherever you specify your blackberry.event.add event listener on Invoked, it will go in through that area. Right?
So when you invoked, your index opens, that's when your event listener...
You'll probably want to do it there anyways, just so that right away you've got your event there. So that you can kind of specify from there where you want to go. So something like BBUI, quite often you'll see in the samples, it's right there in the index.html and then farms it off to wherever it should go.
Okay. The second question is, can you receive on the share event, so can you add on like Facebook and LinkedIn have, or can you also hook into your own custom share?
Yeah. So you can specify in the Config.xml, I think that was not too far back. Here, so you can actually specify bb.action.share and then specify the MIME type of what you want to share, that kind of thing. So you can get very specific or narrow depending on what you want. But if you say bb.action.share, you can be a share target that will show on the share list depending on if the invocation matches the criteria that you've put there. Yeah.
I don't have a dev alpha device, so I'm using Ripple simulator and the VMware device alpha simulator.
Right.
But my experience is the Ripple does not support the PIM libraries, and the simulator does not load a lib context library.
Right.
So what am I supposed to do?
Trying to think of a good answer for that. I'm not sure I have a good answer for that question. We're working on getting that kind of, at least a mocking framework for the PIM APIs into Ripple. It's not quite there yet. And the simulator is interesting. I'm going to, later this afternoon, I have a session with Matt Whiteman on the simulators where we're going to talk about the simulator and Ripple. I'll ask him about the PIM thing. That worries me a little bit. I'm not sure why that doesn't work in the simulator.
Yeah, it was like 3 weeks ago. Maybe it has improved. But
okay, I'll talk to Matt about that and make sure we get that figured out. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
I've tried invoking the browser, which works brilliantly, but I'm wondering if you have any established patterns for example, I open the website of a scoop shop, and they might have links, and they might be opening new windows. And when you do this in a card, you stay in your app, but where are the limits of this? What happens if, for example, they want to open a new window?
So you could look at, so with the most recent WebWorks SDK, we support something that we call a child browser. So we actually support window.open, and it'll bring in a card within your application. It won't go out to the browser. It'll actually bring a card in and show that content within your application. And it just provides a very, very rudimentary UI on it to just go back to your application kind of thing. And from there, it's just web content. It would, if they just do a navigation from there, it would go, just replace that page kind of thing. So you can bring it into your app without having to go out to the browser. So that might be an option you might want to look at. So that supports window.open as well as target blank links within your HTML content. So we'll just bring a card into your app to display that content. So it's just like a new web view on top of your application. That might be a way to go.
And you only get one, no matter what they do.
Yeah, so I believe if they have target blanks or window opens, I think it just puts, depending on what you put in your Config.xml, what white domains you've whitelisted. If it's a whitelisted domain that they're going to, it will replace the content within the child browser. But if it's not whitelisted, it will farm it off to the browser again. So then it will go and invoke the browser application to display that content.
Interesting. Thank you.
Okay.
When you invoke a camera card, do we have mandatory the user to interact with, or can we ask to capture an image?
I'm not sure I
I'm
answer
sorry.
that directly. No, it's okay.
When you invoke the camera,
Yep.
we have basically what the user have with when he starts the camera application.
Correct.
And he has to tap the screen to take a picture.
Correct.
Is there a way we can invoke the camera and take a picture without interaction?
No, I
Is
don't.
it possible, or because
I don't believe so. I think they still have to interact with it. You can't go have it take the picture and come back without any user interaction. They'll have to click to take the picture. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just real quickly, I noticed that when you invoke, sometimes the sheet rises from the bottom
Right.
with files, and then most of the time it comes in from the right.
Yep.
Do we have any control over that, and what are the guidelines on the patterns?
It is pattern-based, and it's a concept of cards, whether they are, I'm trying to think of the exact terminology, but I think it's viewer or composer. So if the goal of this card is to just display some information or something like that, it's usually configured as a viewer, and they'll slide in from the right. If it's a composer, like composing a new contact or composing a new email, They slide in from the bottom. That's just a BlackBerry 10 convention that was determined on. And so if your card is defined to be a viewer, you'll come in from the right. If you're defined to be a composer, that you're going to take some action and return some data, they'll typically come in from the bottom. Yeah. Last call. Any other questions? Okay. Awesome, guys. Have a good time. Thanks.